The morning sun cast long shadows across the City Hall steps as Angela Richardson sipped her coffee from a paper cup. Today wasn't just any day. 6 months into her role as the state's first black female governor, she had made it her mission to understand what real people faced in their interactions with authority. No cameras, no security detail hovering nearby, no fancy suit that screamed important person coming through. Just Angela in jeans, a simple blouse, and her mother's worn leather jacket. Sometimes you need to see things with your own eyes, she had told her concerned chief of staff that morning. I can't fix what I don't truly understand. The Community Policing Forum had been in the works for months. Police chiefs, community leaders, and regular folks would all be there, discussing how to build trust between officers and the neighborhoods they served. As governor, Angela was scheduled to give the opening address, but she had other plans first. She checked her watch. 2 hours before she was officially supposed to arrive. Perfect. Her security team thought she was still at the hotel preparing her speech. They'd be furious when they found out, but Angela had learned long ago that some rules needed bending if you wanted real change. The conference center bustled with early arrivals, volunteers setting up chairs, tech people checking microphones, and a few eager attendees who wanted good seats. Angela slipped past them all, just another face in the crowd. She found a spot in the back row and settled in, watching the room fill up. From here, she could listen to honest conversations without people changing their tone, because the governor was listening. Officer Pete Wilson didn't want to be here today. Traffic duty would have been better than playing security at some talking head conference where everyone would just complain about the police. 23 years on the force had hardened him into a man who saw threats everywhere. When the captain had assigned him to check credentials at the VIP section, he'd grumbled all morning. Just keep an eye out for troublemakers, the captain had said. The governor's coming later and we don't want any problems. Wilson scanned the room with practiced eyes. Most people were where they should be, setting up displays, checking in at the front desk, or sitting in the general admission area. But something about the woman in the back corner caught his attention. Dark skin, casual clothes, no visible badge or pass, sitting in an area that would later be cordoned off for officials only. She was writing something in a small notebook, looking too comfortable, too observant. Not on his watch. Wilson squared his shoulders and walked over. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying that official police tone he'd perfected over decades. "This section will be restricted soon. Can I see your credentials?" Angela looked up, her expression friendly but neutral. "Oh, I'm just sitting here for now. The event hasn't started yet, has it?" Wilson's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about her calm confidence irked him. Most people got nervous around cops. She didn't. "It hasn't started, but we're securing certain areas early. You'll need to move to the general seating area unless you have proper clearance." Angela closed her notebook. "I understand. But since the event isn't for another hour, I thought I'd just sit quietly and prepare. I'm not disturbing anyone, am I?" Wilson felt a flicker of annoyance. Why couldn't she just do what she was told? In his experience, people who questioned simple instructions were usually hiding something. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID, please." His hand rested instinctively near his belt. A few heads turned their way. Angela noticed this but kept her voice even. "Officer, I don't think showing ID is required to attend a public forum. I'm simply sitting here." Wilson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, we have high-profile guests coming today. Either show me some identification or move to the general section. Those are your options." Angela considered her choices. She could easily end this by revealing who she was, but then she'd lose the chance to experience the event as an ordinary citizen. This interaction was exactly why she'd come early, to see how people were treated when they weren't recognized as important. "I understand your concerns," she said carefully, "but I'd prefer to stay here a bit longer if possible. The event is open to the public and this section isn't roped off yet." Wilson's patience was wearing thin. Who did this woman think she was? In all his years, he'd learned that people who refused simple requests were usually trouble. He tapped his radio. "I might need some assistance in the east corner," he said, eyes still locked on Angela. "Got someone refusing to comply with security protocols." A small crowd had begun to notice the tension. An older man with glasses half raised his phone, then thought better of it and lowered it. A woman whispered something to her companion. Angela remained seated, her posture straight but relaxed. "Officer," she said quietly, "I don't think we need to escalate this. I'm simply here for the forum like everyone else. Wilson's radio crackled. Copy that. Sending Thomas your way. Angela sighed inwardly. This was revealing more than she'd expected about how quickly situations could intensify when authority felt challenged. She made mental notes for later. How the officer's body language had changed, how bystanders reacted, how quickly backup was called. These were the real-world details that never made it into official reports. Officer Thomas, younger and eager to prove himself, approached briskly. What's the situation, Wilson? This woman won't show ID or move from the restricted section, Wilson explained, his tone suggesting this was a serious security threat rather than a seating dispute. Thomas turned to Angela with what he probably thought was an intimidating stare. Ma'am, we need you to comply with security protocols. This isn't optional. Angela looked between the two officers. The situation had drawn more attention now. People were definitely watching, some with concern, others with the wary discomfort of those who didn't want to get involved. This was exactly the kind of moment the forum was meant to address, how simple interactions could spiral when communication failed on both sides. I understand you're doing your job, Angela said calmly. But I'm simply sitting here quietly. The event hasn't started and I'm not causing any disturbance. Wilson's face flushed slightly. That's not the point. The point is following instructions from law enforcement. A woman from the event staff approached, clipboard in hand and confusion on her face. Is there a problem here, officers? Just handling a security issue, Wilson said dismissively, not taking his eyes off Angela. Nothing to worry about. The staff member glanced at Angela, then back at Wilson. What seems to be the issue exactly? This area isn't restricted yet. We're securing it early, Wilson insisted. Standard protocol. Angela caught the staff member's eye. There was a flicker of recognition there, quickly suppressed. The woman checked her clipboard with sudden intense interest. Officers, perhaps I could speak with you for a moment, the staff member said, her voice taking on a new urgency. Wilson waved her off. In a minute. We're handling this first. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, sensing something wasn't quite right about his colleague's approach. Maybe we should hear what she has to say, Wilson. But Wilson had committed too fully to back down now. 23 years of being the authority figure didn't allow for easy course correction. Ma'am, he addressed Angela one final time, this is your last chance to comply before we have to escort you out. Angela looked at her watch. Her planned anonymous observation time was nearly up anyway. Her staff would be arriving soon looking for her. She had seen enough. How quickly a simple question about seating could become a power struggle. How tone and assumption shaped interactions more than actual rules or laws. You know what? She said, gathering her notebook and standing up. I think it's time for me to go anyway. Wilson nodded, satisfied at having won the standoff. Thank you for cooperating. But instead of heading toward the exit, Angela pulled out her phone. I just need to let my staff know where I am. Your staff? Wilson's eyebrows rose. Angela smiled slightly as she typed a quick message. Yes, they'll be wondering where I've disappeared to. It's almost time for me to get ready for my speech. Wilson's expression shifted from confusion to the first inkling of doubt. Your speech? The staff member who had tried to intervene earlier approached again, this time with the event director beside her. The director's face showed panic mixed with embarrassment. Governor Richardson, he exclaimed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. We've been looking everywhere for you. Your team just arrived at the back entrance. The color drained from Wilson's face as realization dawned. The woman he'd been threatening to remove, the one he'd called backup to handle, was the state governor. The very VIP he'd been tasked with protecting. Angela gave the officers a small, knowing smile. If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, it seems I need to prepare for my opening address. Thank you for your diligence. As she walked away with the flustered director, Angela heard the staff member explaining in hushed, urgent tones to the officers exactly who they had just confronted. The whispers spread through the gathering crowd, eyes following her with new recognition. This hadn't just been an exercise in understanding. It had become a powerful lesson that Angela knew would shape her upcoming speech in ways she hadn't planned. Some lessons couldn't be written in advance, they had to be lived. Officer Wilson stood frozen in place, his mind racing to process what had just happened. The woman he'd been ready to forcibly remove was Governor Angela Richardson. His stomach knotted as he watched her disappear down the hallway with the event director, who kept glancing back nervously at the officers. "Did you know?" Thomas whispered, his face pale. Wilson shook his head, unable to form words. In 23 years, he'd never made a mistake this big. The staff member who had tried to intervene earlier looked at them with a mixture of pity and frustration. She arrived early without her security detail. "We were told she might do that, but most of us didn't know what she looked like in casual clothes." She lowered her voice. "You might want to prepare yourselves. This isn't going to go away quietly." People nearby were already whispering, some openly staring at the officers. A few had phones out, though whether they had recorded anything was unclear. Wilson felt exposed under their gaze, like his uniform had suddenly become transparent. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked, his earlier confidence evaporated. "We do our jobs," Wilson replied automatically, though his voice lacked conviction. "Keep securing the venue." But as they moved through their tasks, Wilson felt as if he were walking underwater. Everything had changed. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him with each passing minute. He'd been so sure of himself, so certain that the woman was an intruder or troublemaker. Never once had he considered another possibility. In the preparation room behind the stage, Angela sat quietly as her staff fluttered around her. Her press secretary, Diane, was particularly agitated. "You can't just disappear like that." Your security detail was ready to lock down the entire building. Diane checked her tablet, scrolling through messages. "And now I'm getting reports about some incident with local police? What happened out there?" Angela took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "Something important. Something I need to address in my speech." "You're changing the speech? Now?" Diane looked horrified. "The teleprompter is already loaded with the approved text." "Then unload it," Angela said calmly. "I'll speak without it." Diane opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. In the 6 months they'd worked together, she'd learned that this particular tone from the governor meant the decision was final. "What exactly happened out there?" she asked instead. Angela set down her water glass. "I got to experience firsthand what we're here to discuss today. How quickly authority can escalate a situation. How assumptions shape interactions." She looked up at Diane. "I want the officers involved to be in the audience during my speech. Can you arrange that?" Diane's eyes widened. "You want the officers who tried to remove you to be front and center? Are you planning to call them out? Just make sure they're there," Angela replied, turning to review her notes. Back in the main hall, the atmosphere had transformed. What had been a casual gathering was now charged with anticipation. Word had spread about the incident, growing with each retelling. By now, some versions had the governor being handcuffed, while others claimed she had deliberately set up the officers. Wilson found himself reassigned away from the front entrance to a corner near the stage. Not quite a punishment, but close enough that he understood the message. His captain had arrived, pulled him aside for a tense conversation, and then stationed him where he could be easily observed. "Just do your job and keep your head down," the captain had said. "We'll sort this out later." But Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that later would be too late. In the age of social media and instant news, his career might already be over. One bad decision, one wrong assessment, and everything he'd worked for could disappear. The crowd continued to grow, the room filling with community members, police officials, local politicians, and media. Wilson noticed more cameras than expected. Had news of the incident already reached the press? He tried to make himself invisible, standing straight but avoiding eye contact. Thomas had been moved to the opposite side of the room. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the crowd, sharing a moment of mutual dread. The event director finally took the stage, tapping the microphone to quiet the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this important community forum on police-community relations. Today's discussion is more relevant than ever as we work together to build trust and understanding between law enforcement and the citizens they serve." Wilson tuned out the platitudes, focusing instead on controlling his breathing. His palms were sweaty inside his gloves. The collar of his uniform felt too tight. "And now," the director continued, "it is my great honor to introduce our special guest, a leader who has championed transparency and accountability in public service, who has made community relations a cornerstone of her administration. Please welcome Governor Angela Richardson." The applause was enthusiastic as Angela walked onto the stage. She had changed into more formal attire, a simple but elegant pantsuit, but Wilson immediately recognized her. How had he missed it earlier? In retrospect, her confidence, her poise, even the way she had spoken to him, all should have been clues. Angela approached the podium, smiling warmly at the audience. Her eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly when she spotted Wilson in his corner. He fought the urge to look away. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "This forum addresses something deeply personal to me, and I'd like to begin with an experience I had just this morning, right here in this very room." The audience quieted, leaning forward. Those who had heard whispers about the incident straightened in their seats. "I arrived early today without my security detail, dressed in jeans and a jacket," Angela continued. "I wanted to observe, to listen, to understand the dynamics of this gathering without the filter that comes with my title." Wilson felt dozens of eyes turn in his direction. His face burned. "What happened next was both troubling and enlightening," Angela said. "I was approached by an officer who instructed me to leave an area that wasn't yet restricted. When I politely questioned this, the situation escalated quickly." She recounted the interaction in detail, her tone measured and free from accusation. Wilson was surprised by her accuracy. She didn't exaggerate or twist what had happened. If anything, she downplayed some of his more dismissive responses. "Now I could stand here and use this story to point fingers," Angela continued. "I could talk about how I was profiled, how assumptions were made about me based on my appearance. But that would miss the deeper lesson." She paused, looking directly at Wilson again. "The officer who approached me wasn't a bad person. He wasn't trying to discriminate. He was doing what he thought was his job, protecting an event, maintaining order. The problem wasn't the individual. It was the system that trained him to see certain people as inherently suspicious, that rewarded quick judgment over careful consideration, that prioritized compliance over communication." Wilson felt something unexpected, a small loosening of the knot in his stomach. She wasn't calling for his badge. She wasn't painting him as a villain. She was doing something far more powerful. She was using him as an example of a larger truth. "What happened to me this morning happens to people across our state every day," Angela continued, her voice gaining strength. "The difference is that most people don't have the shield of being governor to protect them when they question authority. Most people don't have the privilege of knowing that in the end, they'll be recognized and respected regardless of how they're initially treated." The audience was completely silent now, captivated, and that's why we're here today. Not to blame, not to shame, but to understand. To recognize that building trust between police and communities requires honest conversation about these moments. These interactions where authority meets questioning, where protocol meets humanity. She stepped away from the podium, moving to the center of the stage. "I want to address the officers involved directly," she said. Wilson's heart pounded so loudly, he was sure others could hear it. "Thank you," Angela said, surprising everyone in the room. "Thank you for giving me the most powerful teaching moment I could have asked for. Thank you for showing me, not in theory but in practice, exactly why this forum matters." She gestured toward Wilson's corner. "The officer who stopped me is here today. I asked for him to be present not to embarrass him, but because his perspective matters too. Because real change happens when we all acknowledge our roles in these interactions." Wilson stood perfectly still, aware that he had become part of her speech, part of her lesson. In any other circumstance, he would have resented being used this way, but there was something in her approach, a genuine desire to understand rather than condemn, that kept his defensiveness at bay. "Officer," Angela said, addressing him directly, "I invite you to join our panel discussion later. Your voice belongs in this conversation, not as someone who made a mistake, but as someone who can help us understand how we train, support, and guide those who carry the heavy responsibility of authority in our communities." Wilson managed a small nod, unable to trust his voice. Angela turned back to the wider audience. "This is how change happens, not through speeches or policies alone, but through moments like these. Uncomfortable, honest moments where we confront the reality of our system and commit to doing better." The rest of her speech outlined specific initiatives, community oversight boards, revised training protocols, expanded mental health response teams to reduce police involvement in crisis situations. But Wilson barely heard the details. He was still processing her invitation, her refusal to make him a scapegoat. When she finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, moved by her vulnerability and her vision. Wilson didn't applaud. His hands remained clasped behind his back, but something had shifted inside him. The knot of fear had transformed into something else, something that felt almost like possibility. As the crowd began to settle and the next speaker prepared to take the stage, Wilson's radio crackled. It was his captain. "Wilson, report to the side entrance. The governor's chief of staff wants to speak with you." This was it, he thought. Despite her words on stage, there would be consequences. There always were. He made his way through the crowd, keeping his eyes forward, ignoring the whispers that followed him. At the side entrance, a stern-looking woman with a tablet waited, her expression unreadable. "Officer Wilson?" she asked, though she clearly knew who he was. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, bracing himself. "The governor would like you to participate in the closed-door session with police leadership after the public forum," she said, her tone businesslike. "She believes your perspective would be valuable." Wilson blinked in surprise. "My perspective?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "You just became the centerpiece of her new police reform initiative, Officer Wilson. The governor believes that change comes from within the system as much as from outside it. She wants people who've experienced these moments firsthand to help shape new approaches." Wilson wasn't sure how to respond. Was this a second chance or a more elaborate form of punishment? Either way, he recognized that his role in today's events had irrevocably changed. From enforcer to example, from problem to potential solution. "I'll be there," he said finally. The chief of staff nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "She meant what she said, you know, about not blaming individuals for systemic problems. The governor's good at separating the person from the pattern." As she walked away, Wilson stood alone in the quiet hallway, uniform suddenly feeling both heavier and somehow more meaningful than it had that morning. The governor had done something unexpected. She hadn't just exposed a problem, she'd offered him a way to be part of addressing it. For the first time since the incident, he felt something close to hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the end of his career, but the beginning of something new, something better than the 23 years that had come before. The public forum continued for another 2 hours, with community members stepping up to the microphone to share their experiences. Some stories were angry, some tearful, others hopeful, but all carried the weight of truth. Officer Wilson stood at his post, listening more carefully than he ever had before. Each speaker seemed to be talking directly to him now, though most had no idea of his role in the morning's events. An elderly black man described being pulled over 14 times in a single year, always for minor or non-existent infractions. A young mother explained how her 10-year-old son had developed anxiety about playing in their front yard after a neighbor called the police on him for being suspicious. Teenager recounted being handcuffed face down on the sidewalk because he matched the description of someone reported nearby. Wilson had heard similar stories before, in other community meetings, other sensitivity trainings. He'd always categorized them as exceptions or exaggerations, unfortunate incidents that didn't reflect the reality of policing as he knew it. But today, after his own experience, he found himself considering a difficult possibility. What if these weren't exceptions at all? What if his understanding of reality was the thing that needed adjustment? Across the room, Thomas seemed to be having a similar realization. The younger officer's expression had shifted from defensive to contemplative as the stories continued. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, sharing silent acknowledgement of how much had changed in just a few hours. When the public portion ended, there was a short break before the closed-door session. Wilson found himself standing awkwardly near the refreshments table, avoided by colleagues who had heard about the incident and unsure where to place himself in this new reality. "Tough morning, huh?" Wilson turned to find Thomas beside him, 2 coffee cups in hand. He offered one to Wilson. "Thanks," Wilson said, accepting the coffee. "And yeah, you could say that." They stood in silence for a moment, watching people mingle across the room. Governor Richardson was surrounded by a small crowd, listening intently to each person who approached her. "She's not what I expected," Thomas said finally. Wilson nodded. "No, she's not. Are you going to the closed-door thing?" "Been invited," Wilson replied. "You?" Thomas shook his head. "Nope, but the captain wants to see me afterward. Probably getting reassigned to traffic duty for the next decade." Wilson considered this. I don't think so. Not if the governor meant what she said about systems over individuals. You believe that? Thomas asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Wilson watched as Angela laughed at something someone said, her hand resting briefly on their shoulder, a natural, human gesture that politicians rarely managed convincingly. I think I'm starting to, he said. The closed-door session was held in a smaller room upstairs. When Wilson arrived, he found about 30 people already seated. Police chiefs from across the state, a few mayors, community advocates, and academic experts on policing. Governor Richardson sat at the head of the table, her chief of staff standing behind her chair. Wilson hesitated in the doorway, suddenly aware of how out of place he was. These were decision-makers and experts. He was just a beat cop who'd made a very public mistake. The governor spotted him and waved him in. Officer Wilson, I'm glad you could join us. There's a seat here. She gestured to an empty chair about halfway down the table. All eyes turned to him. Wilson recognized his own captain, whose tight expression suggested he was still processing the day's events. There were a few other familiar faces, chiefs from neighboring departments, community leaders he'd encountered at other events. Most regarded him with curiosity rather than judgment. He took his seat, nodding awkwardly to those around him. The governor didn't introduce him or explain his presence, simply continuing the conversation that had been underway. As I was saying, I believe today's forum highlighted something crucial, the gap between policy and practice. We can write perfect regulations and procedures, but what matters is what happens in those daily interactions between officers and citizens. A police chief from the northern part of the state leaned forward. With all due respect, Governor, officers make hundreds of judgment calls every week. We can't script every interaction. I agree completely, Angela replied, which is why we need to focus on the underlying assumptions and training that inform those judgment calls. She turned toward Wilson. Officer Wilson, you've been on the force for… How long? 23 years, ma'am, he replied, his voice steadier than he expected. In those 23 years, approximately how much of your training focused on communication skills versus physical control tactics? Wilson considered the question seriously. I'd say about 80% physical tactics and response protocols, 20% communication, maybe less on the communication side. And would you say that reflects the reality of your daily work? 80% physical intervention? No, ma'am, Wilson admitted. Most days it's all talk. Just trying to get people to listen, to calm down, to cooperate. Angela nodded, turning back to the room. This is what I'm talking about. We train as if every situation is potentially violent, then wonder why officers approach routine interactions with their guard already up. A community advocate spoke up. It's more than training, though. It's about who becomes a police officer in the first place and why. It's about department culture that rewards certain approaches and punishes others. Absolutely, Angela agreed. Which brings me to my next point. Officer Wilson, why did you become a police officer? The directness of the question caught Wilson off guard. He'd been prepared to discuss the morning's incident, not his life choices. But something about the governor's approach, her genuine curiosity rather than accusation, made him answer honestly. My dad was a cop, he said. So was his dad before him. It was just what we did. Serving the community, protecting people. And in those early days, what did success look like to you? How did you know you were doing a good job? Wilson thought back to his rookie years, the memories surprisingly clear. Keeping order, making sure people followed the rules. Catching the bad guys, he paused. It was pretty simple then. Black and white. And now, Angela pressed. 23 years later. Wilson looked around the room, aware of the attention on him but finding an unexpected comfort in it. For once, someone in power actually wanted to hear what he thought. Now I know it's not simple at all, he said slowly. There are so many gray areas, so many judgment calls. Some days I don't even know if I'm helping or making things worse. A murmur went through the room. This wasn't the defiant defense they'd expected from a veteran officer. Angela leaned forward. That uncertainty, that awareness of complexity, that's valuable, Officer Wilson. That's wisdom. But our current system doesn't reward wisdom, does it? It rewards certainty, decisiveness, control. Wilson nodded, understanding dawning. The guys who get promoted are usually the ones with the most arrests, the ones who never question themselves. Exactly, Angela said, turning to address the entire room again. We've created a system that selects for and rewards the very qualities that can make community relations so difficult, and then we blame individual officers when things go wrong. The discussion continued, weaving between policy proposals and personal experiences. Wilson found himself contributing more than he'd expected, drawing on his years of street-level perspective. The academics in the room had research and statistics. The chiefs had management experience, but Wilson had something they didn't, the view from the ground, where policy met reality. About an hour into the meeting, Angela's chief of staff leaned down to whisper something in her ear. The governor nodded, then addressed the room. I've just been informed that footage of this morning's incident has been posted online and is gaining traction on social media. She looked directly at Wilson. I'm sorry about that, officer. I had hoped we could address this constructively before it became a public spectacle. Wilson felt his stomach drop. Of course, someone had recorded it. These days, everything ended up online. He imagined the comments, the calls for his firing, the way his family would react seeing him portrayed as the villain. What happens now? He asked, his voice quiet. Angela considered him thoughtfully. That depends partly on you. We can issue a standard statement about an unfortunate misunderstanding, or we can try something different. She glanced around the room. This might be an opportunity to demonstrate the very change we're discussing. The police chiefs exchanged nervous glances. Public relations crises involving officers were typically handled with carefully worded statements, and officers kept far from cameras. What do you have in mind? Wilson's captain asked warily. Transparency, Angela replied simply. Officer Wilson and I could address this together. No script, no deflection, just honest discussion about what happened, what we both learned, and how it connects to the changes we're proposing. Wilson felt a chill run through him. Face the cameras? Voluntarily? I'm not sure that's a good idea, he said. I don't have training for that kind of thing. Angela smiled slightly. That's precisely why it might work. People are tired of polished statements and PR spin. They want authenticity. A community advocate who had been quietly listening spoke up. I think the governor's right. This could be powerful, showing an officer willing to reflect publicly on a mistake, paired with a leader who doesn't just point fingers but acknowledges systemic issues. Wilson looked to his captain, hoping for a lifeline. Instead, he found careful consideration. It's risky, the captain said finally, but maybe that's what we need right now. The usual approach hasn't exactly been winning us public trust. The room turned to Wilson. Somehow he had become the center of this decision, his comfort secondary to the potential impact. I don't know what I would even say, he admitted. The truth, Angela suggested. Just what you've been sharing with us. Your perspective, your experience, your recognition of the complexity. Wilson thought about his options. He could refuse, of course, could hide behind department protocols about media interactions, but that felt like a retreat to the old ways, the very systems they'd spent the past hour critiquing. Okay, he said finally. I'll do it. But I want to be clear that I'm speaking for myself, not the department. The captain looked relieved at this caveat. Agreed. This is Officer Wilson's personal perspective, not official department policy. Angela nodded. That's fair. Diane will arrange a brief press conference for after this session. Nothing elaborate, just a chance to address what happened directly before the online narrative takes over completely. As the meeting resumed its previous topics, Wilson found his mind drifting to what lay ahead. In 23 years, he'd actively avoided cameras, leaving the public speaking to those with rank or ambition. Now he would be facing reporters, addressing a viral incident, speaking about issues that extended far beyond his usual concerns of shifts and patrols. Yet alongside the anxiety was something unexpected, a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt that his experience mattered, that his voice could contribute to something important. The governor could have easily thrown him under the bus, used him as an example of everything wrong with policing. Instead, she had invited him into the conversation, treated him as part of the solution rather than just part of the problem. When the session ended, people lingered, forming smaller discussion groups. Wilson found himself approached by several community advocates who wanted to hear more about his perspective. Their questions were challenging but not hostile, genuinely curious about how certain policies played out at street level, what resources officers lacked, what pressures shaped their decisions. "Officer Wilson?" It was Diane, the governor's chief of staff. "We're ready for you now." Wilson followed her to a small room that had been hastily arranged for the press conference. About a dozen reporters were already seated, cameras set up at the back. Governor Richardson stood near a podium reviewing notes with an aide. She looked up as Wilson entered, offering a reassuring smile. "Ready?" "Not really," Wilson admitted, "but I'll do my best." "That's all anyone can ask," she replied. Then, more quietly, "Just speak from experience, not training. The truth is always more compelling than talking points." They took their positions side by side, no podium between them and the press. Angela began with a brief statement, explaining the morning's incident without embellishment. She didn't downplay Wilson's actions nor overstate their significance, just laid out the facts as they had occurred. Rather than treating this as an isolated incident, she continued, "We're using it as a learning opportunity, a chance to examine the dynamics that shape interactions between authority figures and citizens. Officer Wilson has agreed to share his perspective, not as a representative of his department, but as someone with valuable first-hand experience." She stepped back, gesturing for Wilson to speak. He moved forward, the light suddenly seeming too bright, the cameras too intrusive. He had prepared some remarks during the walkover, but now they evaporated from his mind. Instead, he started with the truth. "I made a mistake this morning," he said simply. "I saw a person who didn't fit my idea of who belonged in a certain space, and I acted on assumptions rather than facts. I escalated a situation that didn't need escalating. And if Governor Richardson had been anyone else, just an ordinary citizen without her title to protect her, that mistake could have had serious consequences." He paused, surprised by how steady his voice sounded despite his pounding heart. "I've been a police officer for 23 years. I've always tried to do this job with integrity. But today made me realize that trying isn't always enough, that good intentions don't prevent harmful impacts, that maybe some of what I thought was good policing was actually something else entirely." The reporters were utterly silent, sensing they were witnessing something rare, an officer speaking without a script, without defensive justifications. "I don't have all the answers," Wilson continued. "I'm still processing what happened and what it means. But I do know that I want to be part of making things better, not just defending the status quo. And I'm grateful to Governor Richardson for showing me that change doesn't have to mean blame, that we can acknowledge problems without demonizing individuals." He stepped back, nodding to indicate he was finished. Angela moved forward again, fielding questions with thoughtful responses that consistently shifted focus from the specific incident to the broader issues it illuminated. When a reporter asked if Wilson would face disciplinary action, Angela turned to him. "Officer Wilson has already done something many never manage. He's reflected honestly on his actions and committed to growth. That seems more valuable than punishment." As the press conference concluded, Wilson felt a strange lightness. The weight of the morning's humiliation had transformed into something different, not erased but repurposed into motivation. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't be the same officer he'd been before. Whether that was good or bad for his career remained to be seen, but it felt right for the person he wanted to be. Governor Richardson approached as the reporters packed up their equipment. "Thank you," she said simply, extending her hand. Wilson shook it firmly. "Thank you, ma'am, for not doing what most politicians would have done." "And what's that?" she asked. "Used me as a convenient villain," he replied honestly. "It would have been easier." Angela smiled, the same smile he'd dismissed that morning when she was just a woman in casual clothes. "Easier, maybe, but not better. Not if we actually want change." She handed him a business card with a personal number written on the back. "My office will be forming a task force to develop new training approaches. I'd like you to consider joining us, bringing that 23 years of experience to the table. Think about it." As she walked away, Wilson stood alone in the emptying room, the card heavy in his hand. The day had started with him enforcing boundaries he thought were important. Now all those boundaries, between officers and citizens, between rank and file and leadership, between those who made policies and those who lived with their consequences, seemed less rigid, more permeable, The video would still be out there. Some would still call for his job. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, Officer Pete Wilson felt like he was facing in the right direction. The next morning dawned with Wilson's face splashed across news websites and social media. The story had exploded overnight, with headlines ranging from accusatory, officer attempts to remove black governor from her own event, to more nuanced, mistaken identity leads to powerful moment of public dialogue. The video had been viewed millions of times, shared by activists, police supporters, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike. Wilson sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with a mixture of dread and fascination. He'd turned off notifications after they became overwhelming, but couldn't stop himself from checking how the story was evolving. His wife Lisa placed a cup of coffee in front of him, her hand lingering on his shoulder. "How bad is it?" she asked. Wilson sighed, putting the phone down. "Mixed. Some people are calling for my badge. Others think the governor and I staged the whole thing for publicity. And then there's a whole group treating it like some kind of inspirational moment." Lisa sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own mug. "And which version feels true to you?" It was a good question, the kind Lisa always asked when he brought home the weight of the job. In 20 years of marriage to a police officer, she'd developed a knack for cutting through defenses to the heart of things. None of them exactly, Wilson admitted. It wasn't a racist attack like some are saying, but it wasn't some beautiful planned moment either. It was just a mistake. A normal mistake that turned into something bigger because of who she was. And because she chose to make it bigger, Lisa pointed out. She could have let it go or had you reprimanded quietly. Instead, she put you both on stage. Wilson nodded, thinking again about that press conference, about the governor's invitation to join the task force. "I think she saw an opportunity, not to embarrass me, but to show how these interactions actually happen. Not through cartoon villains, but through normal people making judgment calls based on limited information." His phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen showed his captain's name. "I should take this," he said, already dreading the conversation. Lisa squeezed his hand before leaving him to it. "Wilson," he answered, keeping his voice professional despite the circumstances. "How are you holding up?" The captain's tone was surprisingly gentle. "Managing, sir. Just trying to stay off social media. Good plan. Listen, I've been in meetings all morning with the chief and the PR team. There's a lot to discuss. Can you come in at noon?" "Not in uniform. We're keeping you on administrative duty for now." "Administrative duty. Not suspension, at least." "Yes, sir. I'll be there. And Wilson, the governor's office has been in touch. Whatever happens next, you've got options. Remember that." The call ended, leaving Wilson staring at his phone. Options. The word rattled around his mind as he showered and dressed for the meeting. For 23 years, his path had been clear. Patrol officer moving steadily toward retirement. Doing the job the way he'd been taught, the way his father had done it before him. Now that path had suddenly forked, leading toward possibilities he'd never considered. When he arrived at the station, he was immediately ushered into a conference room where the captain waited with the department's public information officer and the police chief himself. "Officer Wilson." The chief nodded, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for coming in." Wilson took the seat, noticing the stack of papers and printed news articles spread across the table. His incident report from yesterday sat on top, filled out hastily before he'd left for the press conference. "I'll be direct," the chief began. "This incident has created significant challenges for the department. We're receiving record numbers of calls and emails. Media requests are overwhelming our PIO, and officers in the field are reporting heightened tension during routine stops." Wilson nodded, accepting his role in creating this situation. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared for whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate." The chief exchanged glances with the captain. "That's just it, Wilson. We're in uncharted territory here. Typically, this kind of mistake would result in a formal reprimand, perhaps some additional training. But the governor's approach has changed the equation." The PIO, a former reporter named Tanya, leaned forward. "The public response is unlike anything we've seen before. Yes, there are calls for accountability, but there's also surprising support, not just for you personally, but for the transparency of the whole process. People are responding to the honesty of your press conference statements. The governor's office has been in constant contact, the captain added. They're serious about this task force, and they specifically want you involved. They're framing this as an opportunity to turn a problematic interaction into meaningful reform. Wilson tried to process this information. So, I'm not being suspended? No, the chief confirmed. You're on administrative duty for 2 weeks while we let this cool down. But after that, we have a decision to make, or rather, you do. He slid a folder across the table. Wilson opened it to find official paperwork for a special assignment, a 1-year secondment to the governor's task force on police community relations. The governor wants a working officer with real experience, not just administrators and academics, the chief explained. Someone who understands the day-to-day reality of the job, but who has also demonstrated willingness to reflect on its challenges. And I qualify because I made a mistake? Wilson couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. You qualify because of how you handled making a mistake, Tanya corrected. Do you know how rare it is for an officer to publicly acknowledge error without defensive qualifications? To speak candidly about the pressures and assumptions that influence split-second decisions? Wilson hadn't thought of it that way. His press conference comments had felt like simple honesty, the least he could offer after the morning's events. There's something else, the captain said, his expression serious. This assignment would make you highly visible. You'd become a kind of symbol, whether you want that or not. Some officers will resent you for it, see you as betraying the brotherhood. Others will look to you as an example of how to navigate these changing expectations. It won't be easy, Wilson. The weight of the decision pressed down on him. He'd never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be anything but a solid, reliable officer doing his job well. Now he was being asked to step into a role that would challenge everything about how he defined that job. Can I think about it? He asked finally. The chief nodded. Take the week. Talk to your family. This isn't a small thing we're asking. And if I decline? Then you serve your administrative period and return to regular duty, the chief said simply. This isn't punitive, Wilson. It's an opportunity if you want it. Wilson left the meeting with the folder tucked under his arm, his mind churning. In the station hallway, he passed officers who either nodded awkwardly or suddenly found reason to study the floor. Word had clearly spread. He was now that guy, the one who'd become momentarily famous for all the wrong reasons. Outside, the spring air felt good against his face. He decided to walk for a while, needing movement to process his thoughts. Without consciously choosing a destination, he found himself heading toward the park near the station where officers sometimes took their lunch breaks. The park was quiet on a weekday morning, just a few parents with young children at the playground and some older folks on the benches. Wilson chose an empty bench near the duck pond, watching the birds glide across the water's surface while appearing completely calm above and paddling furiously below. Kind of like police work, isn't it? The voice startled him. He looked up to find Governor Richardson standing nearby, dressed casually again in slacks and a light jacket, a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. Falschen Abendsen. Without her security detail or formal attire, she blended in perfectly with the other park-goers. You do this often? Sneak up on people? Wilson asked, too surprised to mind his tone. Angela laughed, gesturing to the bench. May I? He nodded, shifting to make room. To answer your question, yes, I escape whenever I can, she said, sitting down. Being surrounded by security and staff all the time, it creates a bubble. Makes it hard to remember what normal life feels like. Wilson glanced around. Are you alone? That seems risky. My detail is nearby, she admitted, nodding toward a man reading a newspaper on a distant bench and another walking a dog along the path. They've learned to be discreet, compromise between my safety and my sanity. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the ducks. It was strange how comfortable it felt, given their history. I heard they offered you the secondment, Angela said finally. Wilson nodded. News travels fast. Are you considering it? He turned to study her, trying to understand her interest in him specifically. Why me? There are officers with better records, more education, more experience with community outreach. Angela considered the question seriously. When I was a girl, my grandfather told me something I've never forgotten. He said, the most important learning happens at the edge of comfort, in that space between what you know for sure and what you don't understand at all. She gestured toward the police station visible beyond the trees. You've spent 23 years in a system that rewards certainty. Now you're at the edge of that certainty, questioning assumptions you've relied on your whole career. That's valuable, not despite your history, but because of it. Wilson thought about this. So I'm useful because I'm uncomfortable? You're useful because you're willing to be uncomfortable, Angela corrected. Because you didn't retreat into defensiveness when challenged. Do you know how rare that quality is? Not just in policing, but in any institution? The other officers, Wilson began, then hesitated. Many of them think this whole task force is just political theater, that nothing will really change when, and what do you think? Angela asked. Wilson looked out across the park, watching a young father help his daughter feed the ducks. I think most officers want to do right by the communities they serve. But the job changes you, makes you suspicious, makes you see threats everywhere. After a while, it's hard to remember how to be any other way. He turned back to her. If this task force could address that, not just the policies, but the culture, the mindset, then maybe it could matter. Angela nodded slowly. That's exactly why I want working officers involved, not just administrators. The people who feel the reality of the job every day. She stood, preparing to leave. Think about it, Officer Wilson. This isn't about punishing you or using you as a token. It's about building something better together. As she walked away, her security detail subtly converging around her, Wilson remained on the bench, turning her words over in his mind. Building something better. After 23 years of just maintaining the status quo, the idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. His phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. How did the meeting go? He typed back, better than expected. A lot to talk about when I get home. The decision wouldn't be easy. Taking the assignment would mean stepping away from the daily routine he knew, facing resentment from colleagues who might see him as a traitor, and placing himself in a spotlight he'd never wanted. Declining would mean returning to normal duty, where he'd still face whispers and sideways glances, but could at least cling to the familiar. As he walked back toward the station to retrieve his car, Wilson thought about the young officer Thomas, who'd been with him during the incident. How quickly Thomas had called for backup, how readily he'd accepted that someone who didn't look like they belonged should be removed. Wilson had been the same at that age, perhaps even more certain, more rigid. What if someone had challenged his thinking earlier? What if, instead of being rewarded for aggressive enforcement, he'd been asked to consider the impact of his actions on the communities he patrolled? 23 years was a long time to do anything one way. But maybe it wasn't too late to learn another. By the time he reached his car, Wilson had made his decision. He wouldn't give the chief his answer today. He needed to discuss it properly with Lisa first, but in his heart he already knew. The comfortable path back to what he knew was closing, while the uncertain road ahead was opening up. He thought again of the governor's words. The most important learning happens at the edge of comfort. For the first time in years, Officer Pete Wilson was ready to learn something new. 1 year later, the community center buzzed with activity as people filed in for the public presentation. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows. A podium stood at the front with the state seal prominently displayed, and along the side walls, poster boards showcased data, photographs, and quotes from community members. Pete Wilson adjusted his tie, still uncomfortable in the business casual attire that had replaced his uniform over the past year, a year that had transformed not just his wardrobe, but everything about how he understood his role in public service. Nervous? Thomas asked, approaching with 2 paper cups of water. Wilson accepted one gratefully. Always am before these things. Don't think I'll ever get used to public speaking. Thomas had changed too. Still on patrol, but now part of the department's new community engagement unit, a direct result of the task force's recommendations. The unit paired experienced officers with community representatives for joint neighborhood walks, open forums, and youth outreach programs. Full house today, Thomas observed, looking over the growing crowd. Words getting around about what you all have been doing. Wilson nodded, scanning the audience. Community activists sat beside police officers, local business owners next to public defenders. The usual division that characterized these gatherings, law enforcement on one side, community members on the other, had begun to blur over months of sustained dialogue. Officer Wilson? He turned to find Diane, the governor's chief of staff, tablet in hand as always. Ms. Chen, he greeted her formally, though they'd worked closely for months now. The governor's motorcade just arrived. We'll begin in 5 minutes. She glanced at his attire with approval. The blue shirt was the right choice, authoritative without looking like a uniform. Wilson smiled slightly. A year ago, he wouldn't have cared about such distinctions. Now he understood the subtle language of presentation. How a uniform created immediate distance with some community members. How small choices in appearance could open or close doors to conversation. "Any last-minute changes to the agenda?" he asked. Diane shook her head. "Just stick to the plan. The governor will introduce the task force findings, then turn it over to you and Dr. Patel to present the specific recommendations. Questions from the audience will follow, moderated by Pastor Jackson." Wilson felt a flutter of anxiety. Even after dozens of similar events, he still found it surreal to be presenting alongside academics, speaking to rooms full of community leaders and policymakers. Sometimes he still felt like an imposter, just a beat cop pretending to understand complex social dynamics. "You've got this," Thomas said, noticing his expression. "Nobody knows this stuff better than you do. You lived it." A ripple of movement at the back of the room signaled the governor's arrival. Angela Richardson moved through the crowd with practiced ease, stopping to shake hands and exchange brief words with attendees. Even after a year in office, she maintained the direct, personal approach that had won her the election. Wilson watched as she navigated toward the front, where the task force members had gathered. When she reached them, she greeted each person individually, taking time for a genuine connection despite the schedule Diane was undoubtedly trying to maintain. "Officer Wilson," she said when she reached him, extending her hand. Or should I say Lieutenant Wilson now? The promotion had come through just last month, unexpected and, some whispered, influenced by his work with the governor's office. Wilson was still adjusting to the new title and responsibilities. "Still getting used to it, ma'am," he admitted, shaking her hand. "Well deserved," she said firmly. "Your contributions to this work have been invaluable." Before Wilson could respond, Diane was gesturing that it was time to begin. People moved to their seats, the low hum of conversation gradually quieting as Angela took her position at the podium. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room without seeming amplified. "Thank you all for joining us today for this important milestone. 1 year ago, we launched the Task Force on Police-Community Relations with a simple but challenging mission: to fundamentally rethink how law enforcement and communities interact in our state." Wilson sat between Dr. Amara Patel, a sociologist who specialized in institutional culture, and Reverend Jackson, a respected community leader who had initially been one of the task force's most skeptical members. Both had become unlikely allies over months of difficult, sometimes contentious discussions. Most initiatives like this begin with good intentions but end with reports that gather dust on shelves. Angela continued. "We were determined to create something different. Recommendations grounded in real experiences and practical enough to implement in the real world." She glanced toward Wilson with a small smile. "Our work began with a moment many of you may remember, an interaction between myself and an officer that highlighted both the challenges and possibilities in police-community relations. That officer, now Lieutenant Wilson, became an essential voice in our task force, bringing 24 years of practical experience to our discussions." Wilson felt eyes turn toward him. A year ago, this attention would have made him deeply uncomfortable. Now he had learned to accept it as part of the role he had chosen. Angela outlined the task force's process. Hundreds of hours of community listening sessions across the state, ride-alongs with officers, deep dives into department policies, and thorough examination of training practices. She highlighted the difficult conversations that had occurred, the moments when it seemed consensus would be impossible, and the breakthroughs that eventually emerged. "Rather than tell you about our findings myself," she concluded, "I'll now turn the presentation over to two people who were instrumental in shaping them, Lieutenant Pete Wilson and Dr. Amara Patel." As Wilson approached the podium alongside Dr. Patel, he thought back to that morning a year ago. How differently he had seen the world then, how certain he had been of his role and his judgment. The journey from that certainty to his current understanding had been neither straight nor easy. Dr. Patel began with the data, statistics on community trust, enforcement disparities, and officer job satisfaction across departments that had implemented different approaches. Wilson followed with the practical recommendations, changes to training that emphasized communication over control, revisions to evaluation metrics that rewarded problem-solving rather than arrest numbers, and new protocols for handling routine interactions. The heart of what we found, Wilson explained, conscious of keeping his language accessible, is that both officers and community members want the same thing: safety, respect, and the sense that they're being heard. But the systems we've built often work against those shared goals. He described the experimental programs already underway in several departments: joint officer community training sessions, revised use of force policies, dedicated time for officers to engage positively in neighborhoods rather than only responding to problems. Early results are promising, he continued, gesturing to one of the poster displays. In departments implementing these changes, we're seeing increased community reporting of serious crimes, improved officer job satisfaction, and reduced complaints about minor interactions. Dr. Patel added depth to the practical recommendations, explaining the research behind each proposal and the measurable outcomes they expected. Together, they presented a vision that was neither idealistic, fantasy, nor cynical minimalism, a realistic path toward meaningful change that acknowledged the complexity of the issues involved. When they opened the floor for questions, Wilson braced himself for the usual skepticism. Instead, the first question came from a retired officer in the back row. "Lieutenant Wilson, you've been on both sides of this now. Traditional policing and this new approach. What's been the hardest part of shifting your thinking?" It was a good question, one that went to the heart of the challenge. Wilson considered it carefully before answering. "Letting go of the idea that authority equals safety," he said finally. "For most of my career, I believed that maintaining clear authority, making sure people respected the uniform, followed instructions immediately, was how I kept situations safe for everyone involved. The hardest shift was realizing that sometimes authority creates the very tension it's trying to control." He paused, finding the right words. "I had to learn that true safety often comes from connection, not control. That's not easy for officers trained to maintain command presence at all times. It feels vulnerable, feels risky, but the data and my own experience over this past year show it works better, both for communities and for officers themselves." More questions followed. Practical concerns from current officers about implementation, pointed challenges from community activists about accountability measures, detailed inquiries from policymakers about budgetary implications. Wilson and Dr. Patel fielded them together, sometimes deferring to other task force members with specific expertise. Throughout the session, Wilson noticed the governor watching from the side of the room, letting the task force members take center stage rather than inserting herself. It was characteristic of her approach, creating spaces for others to lead rather than dominating every conversation. As the formal presentation concluded and people broke into smaller discussion groups around the display boards, Wilson found a quiet moment to step outside for some air. The community center had a small garden area in the back, peaceful despite being in the heart of the city. He sat on a bench, loosening his tie slightly, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The past year had been challenging in ways he never expected. He'd faced resentment from some fellow officers who saw his work as a betrayal, skepticism from community members who questioned his sincerity, and his own doubts about whether meaningful change was truly possible within institutions so resistant to it. Yet there had also been moments of profound reward. Officers thanking him for giving voice to struggles they'd never been able to articulate. Community members expressing cautious hope after decades of distrust. Young recruits eager to embrace a new vision of what policing could be. Taking a break from your admirers, Wilson looked up to find Governor Richardson approaching. Having slipped away from her security detail again, a habit her staff had apparently given up trying to break. "Just catching my breath," he replied as she took a seat beside him. "You've become quite the public speaker," she observed. A far cry from the nervous officer at that first press conference. Wilson smiled at the memory. "I still get nervous every time. Just better at hiding it now." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and the closer conversations from inside the building. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Angela asked. "How differently things might have gone?" Wilson nodded. "All the time. If you'd been anyone else, if I'd been in a better mood, if Thomas hadn't called for backup so quickly." He shook his head. So many small decisions that added up to that moment. And yet, here we are, Angela said, gesturing toward the community center where their work was being presented. Something worthwhile built from a mistake. Do you think it will last? Wilson asked, voicing the doubt that still nagged at him despite the progress they'd made. After your term ends, after the media moves on to the next story, will any of this stick? Angela considered the question seriously. Some of it will. Not everything. Change never follows a straight line. She turned to face him directly. But something has already lasted, Pete. The officers you've mentored, the recruits who've been trained differently because of our work, the community members who've experienced a different kind of interaction with police. Those experiences don't just disappear. Wilson thought about the young officers in the community engagement unit, including Thomas, who approached their work with a fundamentally different mindset than he had at their age. About the academy instructors who had revised their training approaches based on the task force recommendations. About the community leaders who had begun to partner with police, rather than simply criticizing from the outside. I used to think my job was to maintain order, he said reflectively. Now I understand it's really about building trust. Can't have one without the other. That's a lesson that applies far beyond policing, Angela noted. In politics, in business, in families, trust is the foundation everything else depends on. A staff member appeared at the garden entrance, signaling to the governor that she was needed inside. Angela nodded in acknowledgement before turning back to Wilson. We should get back, she said, standing. But before we do, I wanted to let you know that the State Police Academy director is retiring next year. The position oversees training for every new officer in the state. I think you should consider applying. Wilson blinked in surprise. Ma'am, I don't have the academic credentials for a position like that. What you have is more valuable, Angela replied. You have the lived experience of both traditional policing and this new approach. You can speak both languages, bridge both worlds, she smiled. Just something to think about. As they walked back toward the community center, Wilson found himself considering the possibility. A year ago, such a suggestion would have seemed absurd. A beat cop with no advanced degree taking on a role traditionally held by someone with far more impressive credentials. But a year of working alongside academics, policy experts, and community leaders had shown him that his perspective had unique value. That experience and willingness to learn counted for more than titles or degrees. Inside, the discussions continued, animated but respectful. Wilson rejoined Dr. Patel at one of the display boards, where she was explaining the research methodology behind their recommendations to a group that included both officers and community activists. Ah, Lieutenant Wilson, she said as he approached. Perfect timing. Officer Chen was just asking about how these principles translate to daily patrol work. Wilson stepped into the conversation smoothly, drawing on specific examples from departments that had implemented the recommendations. This had become his role on the task force, the bridge between academic theory and street-level reality, translating concepts into practices officers could actually use. As he spoke, he caught Thomas watching from across the room with a small smile of approval. The younger officer gave him a subtle thumbs up, acknowledgement of how far they'd both come since that morning a year ago, when they'd confronted a woman they didn't recognize as their governor. Later, as the event wound down and people began to disperse, Wilson found himself standing near the entrance, exchanging final words with attendees as they departed. A young black woman approaching officer training age stopped to speak with him. My dad was a cop, she said. He always told me to stay away from the profession, said it would either harden me or break me. But hearing you today, it makes me think maybe there's another way to serve. Wilson felt the weight of her words, the responsibility and the possibility they contained. The job will always be challenging, he said honestly. But yes, I believe there is another way, and we need officers who understand that from the beginning. As she walked away, Wilson thought about all the paths that had led to this moment. The governor's decision to arrive early that day, his own choice to confront her, their mutual willingness to transform a potential disaster into an opportunity for growth. So many moments where things could have gone differently. Officer Thomas joined him at the door. Good turnout, he observed. Wilson nodded. Better than I expected. You know, Thomas said thoughtfully, I still think about that morning sometimes. How quickly I jumped in to back you up, no questions asked. How certain I was that we were right. We all start somewhere, Wilson replied. It's where we go from there that matters. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the community center steps, not unlike the morning shadows a year ago when everything had changed. Wilson loosened his tie further as he and Thomas walked toward the parking lot. The academy director position, Thomas said casually. You going to apply? News traveled fast, as always. Wilson shook his head with a small smile. Still processing the idea. It would be a big change. Bigger than this past year has been? Thomas raised an eyebrow skeptically. Wilson laughed. Fair point. As they reached their cars, Thomas extended his hand. Whatever you decide, just know a lot of us younger officers are watching. Seeing someone like you. Someone who's been in the trenches, willing to question the old ways, willing to change. It matters, Wilson shook the offered hand. Struck by the role reversal from a year ago. Thomas now the one offering wisdom. Himself the one still figuring things out. One day at a time, Wilson said. The phrase that had become his mantra through this journey. That's all any of us can do. As he drove home, Wilson reflected on the strange, unexpected path that had brought him here. From confrontation to collaboration. From certainty to questioning. From enforcing boundaries to building bridges. Not the career he had envisioned when he first put on the uniform 24 years ago. But perhaps the one he had been moving toward all along without knowing it. The academy director position lingered in his mind. Another fork in a road that had already taken so many unexpected turns. Whatever he decided, he knew one thing with certainty. He was no longer the same officer who had approached a casually dressed black woman that morning, secure in his authority and assumptions. That man was gone. Transformed by a mistake that had become, improbably, the most valuable learning experience of his career. Sometimes the most important moments in life aren't the carefully planned achievements, but the unexpected collisions. The times when we're forced to see beyond our assumptions and discover new possibilities. For Pete Wilson, that collision had come in the form of a governor he didn't recognize and a lesson he would never forget.